Morning and welcome to Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School. 2 years ago today would have been the first Sabbath without him. Last week, 2 years, was the last Sabbath with him. So this is a very important week, but the legacy continues. That's what's important. And I think that Roy would have been especially pleased to have Calvin here with us today, because Roy very much wanted Calvin to join us. And I think it took a little urging for Calvin to come to the School of Religion, but we're glad that he did. Before we move any further, Dr. Branson has some guests, I think. Where are you? Right here.
My guests are to my right. This is Adrian Smith and his wife, Cindy. They come, as you might just guess, from the Southern Hemisphere. They come from the town of Port Macquarie in Australia. Adrian is a medical practitioner from that town, and his grandmother was my father's older sister. I don't know what that does to Adrian and me, but we are connected, and in fact, that grandmother and her husband were pioneer missionaries in the New Hebrides when the local indigenes were still cannibals. That was serious trouble, to volunteer to do mission work amongst cannibals. If you lost the day's work, you might end up getting eaten. And that's not the happy ending for a visionary medico, anyway. Adrian escaped that fate, and Cindy and Adrian are just here to learn whether or not all the rumors they've heard about Loma have any substance to them.
Thank you very much and welcome. Thank you. We're glad to have you here. Just a little bit more about Calvin. He's prepared to deal with today's lesson very well, I think. He has a theological doctorate from Fuller Theological Seminary, and then a PhD from our own university in neuroscience. And so that brings the topics together that we have to discuss. Before that, Calvin pastored at the Loma Church, Azure Hills Church, the church in Glendale. Which one?
Vallejo Drive most of the
Vallejo
time.
Drive.
But
and
I was
then
also
that,
I was also in Claremont, North Hills,
right.
Simi Valley, and I've been an associate at Glendale City.
Okay, so he served us well. Let's pause for prayer. God, it almost seems perfunctory and boring to thank our speakers one by one, yet we are genuinely grateful for them. We think of the many things Calvin could have done with his life, and that he devoted his talents to your work is a matter of great interest and importance to us. Help us to learn from him this morning, I pray. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen.
Well, I'm glad to be able to spend this time. This is actually the class I most identify with here at Loma Linda. I'm often teaching elsewhere, and I'm sometimes away with Global Health Institute on various weekend outings with physicians, usually from China. Last weekend from Malawi. And that was particularly fun because these are people who had never seen the ocean before. The trip over to Loma Linda was their very first plane trip. And just to see the wonder and amazement of people who have not seen so much of the world, and that was just such a thrill. And it was cool up there, which is quite nice, which actually brings me well into what I wanted to say right at the beginning. Robert Frost's great poem. Some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice, but from what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if I had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice. Well, I think that this weekend, if we were contemplating on how the world would end, I'm sure most of us would agree that fire feels like the most likely possibility. Not much ice out there today. T.S. Eliot framed it a little bit differently, wondering if the world would end with a bang or a whimper. And in San Antonio, of course, we heard the message that whatever else, it would probably end within the next 5 years, and that there would be there would not, potentially not be another general conference session. And that is the focus of Dr. Johnson's chapter that I'm talking about today. But I want to give you a little bit of personal background, because this is actually a topic that does mean something to me. It was sort of by accident, I think, that this particular date worked out. But end of the world and eschatology is something that has occupied a lot of my thinking over many decades of my life, and actually some of it probably goes back before my own lifetime. My grandfather and grandmother, converts to Adventism, they met at Skogsberg Sanitarium in Denmark. My grandfather was a patient, my grandmother was a nurse. I don't know what they would say about professional boundaries with that in today's climate. But they fell in love, got married, and my grandfather actually had a desire to become a physician. But as he was looking at his options, what could he do? What could he take about what he had learned about health and holistic health and some of the healing that he himself had experienced? And he was talking to people about potentially going to medical school. And he was told that he shouldn't, because the Lord would come before he would have a chance to finish medical school. So he did not go to medical school. They came to the United States. When we talk about immigration, I can say on both sides of my family, I'm a testimony to immigration. But they came to the United States partly to get away from the potential of World War II, which was brewing, and storm clouds on the horizon. A lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty. What should they do? My grandfather opened a small little medical spa, did massage, steam therapy, hydrotherapy, some of the medical traditions that have been quite important in Adventist thinking. A great opportunity to serve, and I can't say in that respect that he did the wrong thing. But they were poor, and they really struggled through the course of his lifetime, and I do know that before he passed away, he did have at least some questions about the choices he had made, and wondered if he had been able to make those choices over, if he would have in fact gone to medical school, because the reason he didn't was time. The 5-year factor. The very thing that Dr. Johnsson talks about in the chapter we're looking at today. Well, the second coming has been a big part of my own thinking, my life. I can remember one of my very first dream memories, dreaming about hiding from Satan. And Satan was throwing dominoes. Now don't ask me where that one came from, but I remember myself and I think some family members, we found a big blanket, we pulled the blanket over our head and dominoes are raining down upon us that an angry Satan who was walking around like a roaring lion was throwing at us. But then the blanket suddenly lifted, and there was Jesus. Jesus dressed in a golden robe and a glittery golden crown, and Satan was fleeing. And Jesus, suddenly I looked at the sky, and the sky was filled with angels, and Jesus was coming. Not too many years later, in second grade as a matter of fact, we had a powerful preacher at our church. We briefly moved away from Southern California, lived in New Mexico for a short period of time because of discovery of oil there, and my dad was in the oil business. Preacher who I've actually seen at Loma University Church a few times in recent years, which is wonderful, because it's nice when you actually get a chance to tell somebody who's impacted your life profoundly, you know what you did for me back so many decades ago. Well, I'm very grateful I've had that opportunity. But he preached powerfully about the second coming of Jesus. And I remember as quite a young child, as I say, second grade at the time, just this deep, profound longing. This is what I want more than anything in the world. That's what I want to see happen. And I remember holding evangelistic meetings in my backyard. I remember reading the book Early Writings, the account of the journey of God's people to the heavenly city. And I cherished that. You know, on all counts, I know people who talk about the difficulties they faced, you know, scary stories at the time of trouble, or ominous things from the red books or something, but my experience was really quite different. It was very, very much where the coming of Jesus was about as central to my thinking as anything could possibly be. And ultimately, when I decided to become a pastor, I think that played a very big role in my own decision, and even was looking back through different notes I have, sermon series that I've done, and even some book attempts that I actually have many chapters of a book I was planning to write. Many chapters already written on Second Coming, Eschatology, and probably a lot of the crux, the heart of my thinking was in a ministry magazine article I wrote back in 1999, and it was entitled "The Time of Trouble, a Great Time to Be Alive." And I look back at that article, and I think it probably captures a lot of the themes that have motivated me, and I'll read in just a minute. I'll share some things from that book in a moment. I mean, not that book, that article in a moment. But I also want to share something that I had written, that I intended to go at the beginning of a book, if I had ever gotten such a thing out. It said, "This is a book about the end of the world for people who normally don't read books about the end of the world." It contains no prophetic charts. It doesn't attempt to pin the label on the beast of the various creatures that strut across the world stage of history, as history careens to an end. It doesn't chronicle the horrors of the modern world in an attempt to make a case that the end must be at hand. What I'm attempting to do is something quite different from what is attempted in many books on the subject. My overarching goal is to connect the end of history with the person of Jesus Christ, and to restore a relational focus that is all too often lost in treatments of the end of the world. But I'm also attempting to do something else. I'm also trying to create a more positive view of the end of human history as we know it, and diminish the fear and negativity that all too often surrounds the subject. I'm suggesting that since history is God's history, since God is writing the script and unfolding events, that we can pack up our fears and replace them with hope and confidence. The historical progression that leads to the apocalyptic end is not an unfolding chasm of horrors that should lead us to retreat in fear from the future, but a promise-laden movement that gives a sound reason for hope as we move forward. And that probably says it all as far as what was driving me. Now, I will admit, we had our scary time of trouble stories back then. My brother and I discovered that Time of Trouble was a good version of vegetarian ghost stories. And we could keep each other awake late at night by trying to see who could out-imagine each other on the most horrible, horrific stories about what might happen in the time of trouble. But honestly, as I look back, it was more like why people tell ghost stories. I can't actually remember being too scared. But I do remember people who do report the terror of those days, and people who say, "I really hope Jesus doesn't come in my lifetime." And I can remember a few others. I certainly didn't want, times when I said, "I hope Jesus doesn't come before my honeymoon," or there are various other things, before I buy my first car, or different times like that, where I actually hoped it would get postponed just a little bit. But in the process, as I say, I got thinking a lot about different versions of the end of time. Now, normally, it's interesting to see how much Adventists tend to parallel some of the other voices on end of time. We may not realize it, but I was looking back through some not ancient, but 19th century history books, and I discovered some prophetic charts and images of beasts and drawings, paintings, and so forth, and even the image of Daniel 2 in a book on the precursors to 20th century fundamentalism. And boy, that image looked just like something from one of our publications. I thought we were unique. I didn't know anyone else was making those pictures. And there were time charts from Daniel, and they had some different events, but they looked a lot like ours. And there was all the year day and some of the apocalyptic. There were other things going on, certainly more hope on some sectors of a millennium that was an age of peace and prosperity here in the world, but there was a lot of stuff that paralleled ours. And certainly, going into the history of the 20th century, as I've tried to parallel Adventists thinking about the end of the world with that of various other groups, we pick up a lot of stuff that was current in history. If you look at all the different interpretations of, the King of the North, or the role of Turkey, the role of the papacy, the role of, there's a lot of things. I grew up when the big apocalyptic message was, the sermon, "Will Russia rule the world?" And all of a sudden, I guess that's prescient again. We went through a while when it did not seem like that was a very, very vital concern, but suddenly Russia splashed across the headlines. But that was the big one when I was growing up. But then I remember also a vegetarian version of Howard Ruff. Any of you know who Howard Ruff was, I don't know if he's still alive. I certainly haven't heard anything about Howard Ruff for years. But Howard Ruff, anyone know what famous book he wrote?
Never heard of it.
Okay, How to Prepare for the Coming Bad Times. And basically he was predicting a grand economic meltdown. He wrote in the mid to late 70s, and I still remember the Adventist evangelists at the time were using Howard Ruff basically as their prophetic text and talking about, really bad things are going to be happening. Look at all this about the great economic collapse. And of course we had the Arab oil embargo going on at the same time, which added a certain amount of credibility to some of those scenarios. We'd completely run out of gas, and we would but people were, the evangelist, even that I remember most vividly, was talking about moving to Oregon, finding a little place along a river, and that's one of the themes we'll look at a little bit is, Lord is coming, run for the hills. And I realized that there really wasn't much about Jesus in the presentation. There was a lot about, horrible things are happening. But that actually is one of the themes I want to address a little bit, is the idea that bad things are happening, then Jesus is coming. Economic troubles, gas troubles, terror, whatever it might be. If bad things are happening, then Jesus is coming. Now, of course, the difficult corollary to that is then if bad things aren't happening, if your life is going pretty well, then Jesus isn't coming. But it also means that we tend to associate a lot, when we think about the second coming, one of the big components, and one of the things that makes it hard for us to even find a place for it in our thinking is, when we think about it, it's the same place that we put, everything from terrorist attacks to North Korea to root canals to IRS audits. It's all this big category of really bad stuff. That that's a problem. A couple other things I just want to mention from my own history. It's interesting, when I was pastoring the North Hills Church, Claremont, Barry Casey, who some of you are familiar with, who was a member there, and he was a student at Claremont School of Theology at the time, and he was talking about the fact that he was studying eschatology. And I thought, somehow I didn't think of that school as where you studied eschatology. But of course then I discovered it was a lot of Jürgen Moltmann's Theology of Hope, which is described as eschatology, but it isn't beasts and charts. And then I certainly, in subsequent theological study, got into things like, noticing that eschatology does have a history, and just a few things I want to mention, like Albert Schweitzer, what he called consistent eschatology, believed that Jesus expected the events in the first century, and we see people like C.H. Dodd, that the events are not future but present, the kingdom has arrived in Jesus. George Eldon Ladd from Fuller Seminary, where I studied, talked about the presence of the future, the proleptic inbreaking of the eschatological future. And of course I encountered a lot with dispensationalists and dispensationalism. Of course, looking at history of eschatology, the most well-known example. Anyone know what book that was probably the best known example of dispensational eschatology? Late Great Planet Earth. Author? Hal Lindsey, yeah. So that was certainly something that splashed across the headlines, and there were movies made about it, and Tim LaHaye picked him up a few years later. But there was even a Left Behind movie from a different source back closer to the time that Lindsey was writing. And my wife and I had gone to a spiritual retreat of some sort, and they decided to show it because they said lots of people had been converted on the basis of that movie. And it was scary, the beasts and the helicopters and everything. The police, were chasing this woman. Well, she wakes up and her husband's shaver is in the sink buzzing, and he's gone. And she realizes, the song starts singing in the background, "You've been left behind." And then, just portrays all the horrible things that happened to her as she's running off through the wilderness, and she's being chased. And finally, at the end of the movie, she jumps off a bridge. I guess she dies rather than getting captured by the beast. But then the song comes in again. "You've been left behind," and then the lights come on. "More people have been converted by this movie than any other movie ever made." That night, my wife, she was hanging on to me for dear life. But Anyway, so we certainly see dispensationalism. But, it's interesting, kind of looking at the general evangelical world. Generally, Adventists have kind of paralleled some things that were happening, things were said in other places, but I'm not hearing as much as eschatology in general. And I can explain what I see a lot of neo-Calvinism. Now, interestingly enough, if my big critique of San Antonio was I heard a lot of neo-Calvinism. And people didn't recognize it. Because, now I want to say this to the more conservative Adventists who will be listening to this. One danger on that side is if it sounds conservative, you assume that it's just what we've always believed. Well, I'll talk about the liberal side too, because I tell people my job is to make everybody unhappy. And so a lot of things that got said, a lot of things we've been hearing recently, people say, oh, that sounds, that's good historic Adventism. It's not. A lot of what we're hearing, I can give you a whole lot of things that are actually reflecting a larger trend in certain quarters of the evangelical world that are neo-Calvinistic. I can give you a whole bunch of things like that. Our view of atonement has been changing. Our view of revelation inspiration has been changing. Our view of the destruction of the wicked has been changing. Whole long list like that. And it's not Ellen White, and it's not historic Adventism. So I just want to point out that if something sounds a headship theology, we heard about that a couple of weeks ago. Last week I was away with the Global Health Institute. A couple of weeks ago, I think it was, we heard about the headship theology. That is not part of historic Adventism. I can trace all these things, and so one of my concerns is we're getting some stuff from elsewhere, and we think we're not being worldly, and I would say maybe we are. So I want to point out that caution. But Johnsson brings out the fact that within 5 years, it may be part of our tradition, but he points out it's not part of, Ellen White does not try to scare people on the basis of time schedules and time frames. And I won't go through and read all the quotes, I actually had them marked, but just for time reasons I won't go through it. But I think Johnsson does a good job of putting that one in perspective. That, this idea that in order to be riled up about the second coming, we have to say it will happen within the next 5 years. I mean, one of the major themes of his chapter is to challenge that. But the question on the other side is people who don't get riled up by the next 5 years sometimes find it pretty hard to find a place for the end of time at all. Or what we call eschatology and the world. And as I say, a lot of my own thinking has been to try to find a balanced view of what can we really find from the scripture? How can we kind of stand back from our scare tactics and our vegetarian hellfire? And, brought a lot of other stuff I can't share here. Also stuff back about Nostradamus and, about how he's been used to predict all sorts of things. World War II, Hitler, Mussolini, Franklin Roosevelt, the assassination of John and Robert Kennedy, the coming of such inventions as air travel, aerial balloons, gas masks, submarines, the London fire, the Challenger explosion, the Chernobyl accident, AIDS epidemic, the identity of 3 antichrists, the decline of communism, and a matter of fact that the Germans dropped thousands of fake Nostradamus leaflets on Belgium and France in 1940 announcing Germany as the supreme victor according to Nostradamus. So just interesting. And then went through a lot of things that were predicted. I mean, like that in April 2, 1987, an Arab leader will mobilize millions of soldiers, marching in Turkey, Iran, and Egypt. Let's see, more from that. But between 95 and 99, China will unite all the Arabs and attack Europe. A year later, New York will be nuked, half of England will sink into the sea by October of 2000, and Satan will be defeated by 2002. So it just shows you, this wasn't Adventist thinking, by the way, but this was more of this apocalyptic stuff out there. I also went back and looked not just at Y2K, but Y1K. Have you done that? When the first 1,000 years of millennium was up, and that was quite interesting as well. One French town, it was reported to have rained blood. People sold possessions. They freed slaves. They broke off affairs. They forgave debts. At Christmas, shopkeepers are reported to have given away merchandise. And on New Year's Eve of AD 999, a large crowd gathered at St. Peter's in Rome before Pope Sylvester II. People were weeping. Many of the crowds came dressed in sackcloth and ashes. One contemporary account said the clock ticking away in the last minutes of the century suddenly stopped. Some people are said to have given up the ghost right then and there from fright. But precisely at midnight, the bells began to peal. And it wasn't long before the old order returned. People attempted to reinstate collection of debt that they had forgiven. Affairs were resumed. Business picked up where it had left off. And then, reading "Behold, the bridegroom cometh" from Samuel Snow, from our own, and then of course remember Y2K, when everything was going to all melt down. Now the last one I remember that kind of permeated the culture was the end of the Mayan calendar, 2012, not that long ago. But there was a ripple about that. Now, you all know why you're here. My daughter heroically sacrificed herself. The very day the world was supposed to end, we were actually in Mayan country. I have a picture of her lying on a Mayan altar, taken the very day the world was supposed to end. So we can just thank Julie. You're all here. Julie gets the credit for it. Anyway, before we turn into discussion, let me just share a few of the themes, though, that I do think are important to me, and then we can... I think a lot of that, just that quotes book introduction for the book that never actually got completed, says a lot of what's big for me and what's motivated me over the years. But I want to point out that apocalyptic movements in general have a hard time growing up. One of the reasons for that is they don't expect to have to. In other words, they expect apocalyptic movements by their very nature are built around the premise that we don't have long. Johnsson points out that the Adventist church has really had a pretty coherent approach in terms of, we've built publishing houses, we've built schools, we've built hospitals, we've done a lot to take seriously one of what I would consider the important themes of what I call Occupy Till I Come. So Adventists have, I think, by and large, found a number of ways to grow up, to realize that one way or another we have to recognize that we're still here. But it's not just hope. I've done quite a bit of historical looking at various apocalyptic movements and looked at different ways people have dealt with what we call cognitive dissonance in the social sciences. The idea that the time is not short, at least as short as they thought. Now, one of the ways that Johnsson talks about, I think we saw at San Antonio, is the belief is, well, they were wrong before, but we're right this time. They were wrong about within the next 5 years before, but if you look at the history of apocalyptic interpretation, that's a fairly common theme. Well, we were wrong before, but this time we've got it right. And you can only kind of recycle that one so many times. You're kind of dependent upon fresh recruits, or people who hadn't really gotten into it before, who are able to be excited for the first time. Most people don't get excited by that repeatedly, right? But it's not just movements, it's individuals. I've had to ask myself as an apocalyptic person, not in the terms of scary, it has to be in 5 years, but I've had some struggles myself. And even when I was going back in this, I said, wow, that was me writing all that stuff. And ask myself, even in the last few years, how life has changed, and some of the newer challenges that have hit my faith, and they aren't always from that same direction. And I've wondered why I didn't keep writing. I guess I can give some reasons why that happened. But a few things I want to say, kind of summary things. I think a lot of them I've already mentioned, and we can go into some discussion. First, one of my big passions is to free the apocalyptic thinking in any sort from bad things. That it's all about bad things. That article about the time of trouble, it's a great time to be alive, I was pointing out the fact that we have thrown into the whole bin of time of trouble a lot of things that don't belong. And, talking about that even Matthew 24, where all the bad things are described, wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes and so forth, actually what Jesus says in that context is don't be alarmed. The significant sign of the coming is not the time of not horrible things, but the preaching of the gospel. And it also talks about as it was in the days of Noah, where people caught up and living their lives, having a good time. And that is the biggest contextual. And I talk about how, just God's promises. And I point out even the promises through tribulation and adversity, which there are many in the Bible, that when such words are used, they're almost always connected very directly with promises. Promises of hope. Promises of God being there for people. So that's my second major premise. Third is that purpose and vitality. When you don't know what life is all about, we create problems out of nothing. A bad hair day and it's apocalypse. dead battery, whatever it might be. And you just look at your lives and all things we use to create catastrophe. There is something about, the great times of life. There have always been times when we faced adversity of one sort or another. So even to whatever degree we face adversity, we don't need to look at that as the end of the world. Well, it is the end of the world maybe, but at some point it actually will be. But then the same as always. Adversity is a time of coming to life, of pulling together. Fourth, it's a time of great personal growth. All sorts of messages, even with what Ellen White talks about. She, I thought I had pulled off the quote, I guess I didn't, but she just talks about, God's people with faces shining. It's pretty amazing, just the time, we talk in the Bible, talks about Elijah message, reconciliation in families, there's a lot of good stuff there. So that's something I would say, just the 4 points I raised in that article, and just a few other things I want to mention, just, in parallel with Johnsson, with Dr. Johnson's book, the idea of occupying till I come. That it is not up to us to tie anything to time schedules, charts, we know when it's going to end. Christ Council, Ellen White has a lot to say about it, a number of quotes she makes on it. Basically, let's get on with life. And I don't mean just a secular life that loses sight of apocalypse, but life that where we're building. Nothing wrong with Vision 2020. Working on our institutions and so forth. And that's something, I guess, I don't know if my grandfather would have made a different decision, but the normal decision would be you live your life, you move forward. You go to school, you make your plans, you do it with the idea that all of these things are transitory. And that's something C.S. Lewis talks about in his essay, The World's Last Night. He says, you don't know. But you do know that these things are transitory. But the counsel is to live. And I think something that, looking at some of the versions of eschatology that are around, is that working for a better world is congruent with eschatology. Now, it's interesting, the current iteration, about the only time I hear eschatology discussed in certain quarters of the more fundamentalist world is in terms of ecology, and it's not a good one. It's why we don't need to worry about climate change or anything like that, because the Lord will come first. Well, I think that's the opposite of what I'm saying, that whatever we can do to make the world a better place, to heal diseases, to help people who have been marginalized, help find hope and a future, to deal with things like economics, to look at world poverty, public health issues, all of these things that we are about. That it's a challenge to do that, to occupy till so that's one thing that I want to stress very strongly, is that whatever else you want to do with it, you don't need to work yourself into a froth of time or fear. Calendar concerns or terror. That's not at all central. That's missing the point. That's not what the Bible says. But one last word before I throw it over for just comments, questions, some discussion together. I do realize that I was fortunate, because when I thought about the second coming of Jesus, for me it was always about Jesus. And even when I was holding evangelistic meetings in my backyard as an 8-year-old, it was about Jesus and wanting to see Jesus. And I was thinking about it in terms of, I realize kids nowadays have not even heard the song "She'll Be Coming Around the Mountain." I think most of you are old enough, you're probably familiar with it. Anyway, it says, she will be riding what? 6 white horses. Will kill what? The old red rooster. And will all what?
Have chicken and dumplings.
Oh yeah, chicken and dumplings. Yeah. And I can't remember all the others, but you guys are good. You know the signs of her coming, right? Do you know who she is? I don't. I have no idea who that song is about. I know all the signs of her coming, but I don't even know, I have no idea who she is. Who is coming around the mountain? I don't know. So anyway, I want us to say that that's, I suppose, as central as anything, is that it's a way of informing us, a way of reminding us that what we see is not all there is, that even our best efforts, our biggest buildings, our most fabulous institutions, our most impressive degrees or accomplishments, our CVs, or whatever it is we build around here in academia, they're transitory. You can't take them with you. And you got to live it all with that in mind. But in the meantime, live it. You know, go to school, pursue your goals, build the institutions, work what you can do to address issues of global health, or economics, or environment, whatever it may be. But that's part of eschatology. It's part of what it means. Finally, just one quote, then let's throw it open here, from Walter Wink. The celebration of divine victory does not take place at the end of the book of Revelation after the struggle is over. Rather, it breaks out all along the way. We have here no sober pilgrims grimly ascending the Mount of Tears, but singers enjoying the struggle because it confirms their freedom. Even in the midst of conflict, suffering, or imprisonment, suddenly a hymn pierces the gloom. The heavenly hosts thunder in mighty chorus, and our hearts grow lighter. Okay, well, that's an attempt to put way too much stuff into a short time. But I hope you at least get some of the themes of some of my own thinking on the issue.
Okay, just like a comment that I want to try to move across. Try to make your question as succinct as possible for our future viewers. And I have my associate today, Jack Bennett. So kind of take it easy on him. Try to move across so that he doesn't have to run back and forth. So, first question.
Adventists in the past have used Matthew 24 and the signs of the second coming as evidence that the second coming was imminent. The great earthquake, the falling of the stars, the dark day, blood moon, and so on. Then Matthew 24 says that those who see those signs will still be alive when Christ comes. Mm-hmm. Well, obviously that generation has been dead for a long time. Mm-hmm. How does the Adventist Church currently deal with Matthew 24, those precursors to the second coming?
Yes, maybe a couple things just historically. Commonly, there have been people who have said that these had their first fulfillment in events surrounding Christ's original ministry, the destruction of Jerusalem, those kind of events. And there was a generation that saw all of those things, and so there were multiple fulfillments. So that's one of the common perspectives on this issue, and used by Bible scholars from a variety of perspectives, and that in some ways, we see maybe a recapitulation of some of those themes at various times. I think what is commonly suggested is that there are various times that these end up being things that are prompts or awakenings, but obviously we have to be very careful about trying to link anything to, say, the Lisbon earthquake or the dark day, which, interesting things about that, about the dark day and some fires up in Canada, I believe it was. Certainly those were things that were, in the context, ended up being great awakenings. And we can look through history, we can find various, what I call prompts to great awakenings. But my own overall take, and I'm not sure this is what you would have heard in San Antonio, because the more apocalyptic sectors tend to say, okay, well, those weren't quite the right ones, or like Johnsson says, they link it to the delay. They say everything could have happened then. Johnsson pretty strongly challenges the notion of, just said delay theology is not biblical or Ellen White theology, and I'll let him speak for that one. But obviously, though, if those were it, then we would have good reason to give up and just say, well, just like a whole lot of other, let's just say, look at my study of apocalyptic movements and how they give up. Often 3 disappointments and the movement disintegrates. That's not an unusual pattern. But anyway, the overall perspective I would have is that the difficult things are prompts. But Matthew also talks about, marrying, giving in marriage, and we find even in some of our own Adventist pioneers some references to that type. James White talks about it. Says, I should have brought the quote where James White talks quite a bit about, just anti-gloom and doom. Says, that just using Matthew and saying that Matthew 24 and 25, there's plenty of things that the world would be just going along, you wouldn't have known anything was happening. So I lean more on the side of saying be very careful about pointing to any bad things. Because they may be a prompt, and I'm not saying God doesn't use them that way, but I'm just saying I see what Johnsson also talks about, apocalyptic burnout. People are just, you can only say it so many times before you say, it's like in a relationship, somebody says, I'm leaving you, and storms out. At some point, if they've done it 100 times, you begin to think, maybe it doesn't mean what they say it means. Anyway, I don't know if that helps, but I'm just saying, historically, in biblical scholarship, tends to, more often link it to the events surrounding the fall of Jerusalem, but to say that there will be, that there's also ideals that the 2 events in some way parallel each other. But just looking at the text itself, there's not as much gloom and doom as most of us have assumed.
Well, thank you so much, Calvin. That was just a wonderful expose of the whole subject. I really appreciate that. I wanted to come back to neo-Calvinism. That's something I don't really know much about. Just in a nutshell, since you're linking that with what you're seeing now in some of the aspects of our church.
Yeah, looking at we often assume that we exist within some kind of bubble, that our world, the Adventist world, is not the same as what's happening outside. And it's easy to believe that sometimes because we have our own Adventist everything, our own Adventist institutions, our own Adventist foods, our own Adventist everything. I say someday somebody will write a story of a General Conference president's son who falls in love with, I can't remember what the theology of it is, and they call it Whamlet. But the son, anyway, but we have our own Adventist everything. But what's interesting to me is how often we pick up trends in the world at large and not realize it's what we're doing. Currently, it's a very complex religious context right now. Several different things going on. One of the things is that evangelicalism is increasingly politicized, so a lot of that is part of what we're seeing. But there's also a very strong neo-Calvinistic movement, which is not necessarily directly the same as the original John Calvin. It has elements of it, but it's not. It has very, very strong on any theory of the atonement other than blood atonement. The forensic blood atonement is wrong. And interestingly enough, like 30 or 40 years ago, so the conservatives were actually against forensic atonement by and large. But now you read some of the, I hate to use labels because then people think I'm on somebody's side. And as I say, my goal is to make everybody mad. No, but people who, I'm hearing some things that are coming out that are different from traditional Adventist theology of the atonement. Ellen White has a very complex view of the atonement. And a lot of it does have to do with what has sometimes been called moral influence, but a lot of the atonement is like, what's described in the hymn, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross, on which the Prince of Glory died. That's considered, the atonement is as much as anything about what it awakens within us. As, the forensic, punitive, bloody God. Neo-Calvinism is very strong on the bloody God kind of thing. And I'm seeing more of that within Adventism, in our view. we don't believe in eternity. Neo-Calvinism is really strong on hell. A God who is not strong enough to roast and toast is not a God I'd want to serve. But I'm discovering some of the stuff, even within our own circles, kind of sounds like that. Neo-Calvinism has a specific view of revelation inspiration. It's kind of a dictational thing. And, if you look at Adventist view of revelation inspiration, we have a more nuanced view historically we have. And I'm discovering some things that are now being written that sound like the Neo-Calvinists, which are not what we've what we've historically said. I need to bring, I have a whole, actually a presentation I did at the School of Religion on listing all the different points, which I say, headship theology, of course, is another example what I pointed out. Adventists have not been into headship theology. And neo-Calvinists, that's a really big thing for them. But a lot of the arguments that were used about women's ordination come directly from headship theology, which is neo-Calvinism and not traditional Adventism. Think of a physician friend of mine, the physician who had to oversee the Salt Lake City Olympics to make sure, decide whether or not to close them down because of anthrax. Has head of public health for Utah for a number of years. Mormon, we were talking about how, some of the differences in a lot of things, including gender. Mormons have more of a history of kind of a patriarchal view. Adventists don't really have that, but we're getting it. And I'm just saying that that's an example. The headship theology is neo-Calvinism. It's not historic Adventism. Even some things on science and religion. Anyway, I could give a lot of others, but I'm just saying, be careful. Just because something sounds good and fundamentalist, those of you who think that that's historic Adventism, be careful. Because just the thing that something gives the trumpet a certain sound, it does not necessarily mean it was always our sound.
Could you elaborate on the science and religion a little bit?
That's another thing. Back when Dave used to have the
Repeat the question.
What they called no lunch bunch on Thursdays. I also did a kind of a history of Adventism and science, and I pointed out a number of things about how Adventists have had a very nuanced view of science, and I could point out a number of views in which Adventists differed from what I call the fundamentalist Bible college approach to science. And even George McCready Price, who, certainly in many ways influenced the early days of our understanding of, flood chronology and so forth. But he was quite mad because he felt that, when the approach to that, he ended up unhappy because Adventists had a much more nuanced approach to science and religion. He believed that the geological column was just simply all random. There was no such thing as a geological column at all. I can, trace a whole, various aspects. That was just one of several, though, where Adventists have had a very, very nuanced approach to science and religion. And yet I do hear some people now, I read some things that basically just sound like, almost, it was good enough, it was good for Paul and Silas, it was good enough for me. Well, we're not talking about Paul and Silas, but just saying we don't even need to ask those questions. They're dangerous questions, and wanting more of the fundamentalist Bible college approach. My point would be that's just not historic Adventism. That's not what our history suggests that we have done.
Thank you very much, Kelvin. One of the places where one sees this, I think one sees a move away from trying to integrate science and religion, very near to here, to one that says we can live with them in separate spheres of information. And I think that's the whole notion of integrating religion and science, even though we have had a hard time to do it, we have had a hard time doing it, that has been a goal. It has not been satisfactory to us just to live in two different spheres.
Right.
So there's a big, big difference here. That's one. Go ahead.
I just want to say, by and large, I feel pretty good about being an Adventist in that regard, despite some anomalies in different places. Because I know a friend of mine who's an atheist was talking about looking at different treatments of science and religion. He says, you Adventists really, you have a lot of good scientific stuff that you're working with and raising questions and so forth. But he said, he was pretty impressed. He said, that he felt there was a lot of good stuff coming in the Adventist church. I just don't want to see us abandon that and simply retreat and go into science is bad, scientists are wrong, they're all evil. There are places that say that, and I would hate to see us. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
Oh, and just another quick comment. 1750 to those people was like 9/11 to us.
Mm-hmm.
If one goes back and reads in that context, appealing to the Lisbon earthquake made cultural sense then.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't now, but it made sense then. Third point, Roy wanted us to use apocalyptic literature in order to inform institutional building. He did not want to see them in tension with each other, but he thought apocalyptic consciousness, let's call it that,
Right.
apocalyptic consciousness did help people to engage in creative things they may not otherwise have done. So he resisted the idea that we have the book, The Great Controversy, and then the book, Desire of Ages. He thought that in some ways they informed each other. And I think that's one of his lasting contributions to us.
Yeah, I would just want to second that. I think that something we see in some other versions of eschatology as well, but I think it's a robust part of an Adventist heritage, is that apocalyptic thinking can be used as the impetus to things we do now, here and now, that really make a difference. Whether it's building medical schools, whether it's looking for cures for disease, whether it's heart transplants, whatever it is, the things we do here and now can actually be informed. I was thinking, was it Ron Osborne's book? Yes, it was more than one, but I'm blanking on the title. There's Apocalypse is in one of the books, but just an example of somebody who's influenced by Roy Branson, who actually used apocalyptic thinking as a way of informing approach to this life in this world. I think of Kendra Holoviak's book, work on Apocalypse, where she looks at the hymns of Revelation and just the hopeful, resounding hymns, and sees that as a crucial theme. And that's something I at least suggested in some of the stuff that I've been working with, is that the book of Revelation is filled with hymns of rejoicing.
I wanted to just give an anecdote about apocalyptic thinking and building institutions, in particular Loma Linda. I was attempting to set up endowments in the 1970s. And this was after the new hospital had been constructed, and we had floated bonds and had borrowed a lot of money. But I was told that to set up an endowment was impossible because it indicated lack of faith. Because clearly, in 5 years, the endowment wasn't going to amount to anything, and the money would just be wasted. And I never did quite understand why it was okay to borrow money, but it wasn't okay to set the money aside so it would grow.
Well, of course, if you borrow money, then it's whoever you borrowed it from. You don't have to pay them back.
Well, I didn't want to go down that road because it made us look a little bit self-serving.
Okay.
But eventually, the board did allow the setting up of endowments. But we had to fight for several months to get permission to set up endowments. Now we have close to $1 billion in endowments in the institution. But at that point in time, it was lack of faith, because an endowment would be useless within a 5-year period.
Yeah. Well, one thing I want to mention is I think we still have a tension that is difficult. I mean, as I say, I mentioned I have a number of Mormon friends, and they've come to grips with money. They're at peace with money. So anyway, we are kind of ambiguous about that. We don't quite know how to approach money. We know how to approach health, we know how to approach buildings, we know how to approach institutions, but when it comes to money, we're, and so we have some very strange discrepancies. Even sometimes when it comes to salaries, we can tell some people, well, we're missionaries, so you're supposed to take a missionary salary. So I said, well, okay, how about your missionary salary? Are you on a mission? So we have a lot of those weird things, and we can make money, and we can sort of find some ways to flaunt money occasionally. But we don't just have a really well thought out approach to economics and how do we handle money, how do investments work, is that okay? My dad talks about, my dad was a legal negotiator for Shell Oil Company, but he wasn't a doctor or a teacher or something like that. He was in secular business. And that was kind of considered pretty suspect. So, even for an industrial strength Adventist like him, but there's just a lot of weird discrepancies about money. And I would just say that's one thing. I think that as far as our Occupy Till I Come, we ought to think through money better than we have. Because we have just too many weird discrepancies. And, sometimes when we suddenly move into the missionary mentality and the austerity mentality, suddenly when we're hemorrhaging money all over the place somewhere else because we haven't really learned how to think about money intelligently. And so anyway, money is one of the things I think we've got to work on. Yeah.
Well, Calvin, for just a moment, I'd like to put the second coming aside. and just look at the world in which we live today. And Noam Chomsky's recent statements that the two biggest threats to civilization is nuclear war and climate change. Now, Noam Chomsky is no lightweight, one of the four-noted thinkers in the world today. But those are the two biggest threats that he sees, plus others that we know. And I'm just wondering, what is the paradigm that we as a church is doing? What paradigm are we coming from as we look to the future, as we plan? Are we looking at a paradigm of business as usual, unlimited growth, unlimited resources, no major threats, or do we see some of these major threats, and is that influencing how we plan budgets or evangelism or healthcare, these types of things?
Yeah, I do want to say, I think, even though I'm reluctant to use threats to say that gives us justification for some eschatological time schedule or time frame or calendar or something, I do believe when I talk about occupy till I come, I don't mean just business as usual. I mean working with the premise that there are things we need to be doing as citizens of the world. We need to take seriously what are the things that are genuine threats to our planet, and one of the things to realize on that is that we can't just cop out with the idea that God will save us from ourselves. So we can do anything we want, it'll be all okay because God will save us. You know, he'll come in and pay off the bill, and basically, you know, we can spend or do whatever we want. I think we need to be intelligent about how we analyze the threats, because when you look at the history of threats, what people worry about, what the actual threats are, don't necessarily parallel. And I've actually even done a little bit of research background on that. At the time when the crime rate peaked, crime was down below other in terms of what people were worried about. After it started dropping considerably, then it rose to the top. So I'm just pointing out, you can point that out with a variety of different threats, that what we worry about and what's the actual threat are not always the same. So that's one reason I would just say, we've got to be intelligent about how we approach these things.
I'd like to just interject there, if I may. Do you think there are groups within the church that are giving serious study to these types of things? Or are we just basically, we need to do this? But are there?
I don't think it's I mean, I think there are places, I'm definitely in context where people are asking those tough questions. You know, I do see colleagues here who wrestle with those things. So it's, you know, we look at them. I think if we get too heavily into Jesus will come within 5 years, it will make it very difficult to do that.
Putting that aside,
Yeah.
I'm not talking about timelines and when Jesus is coming. I'm looking at the future of civilization and our relationship to it. That extinction is a real possibility for the human race.
Yeah, and that's what I would call the secular apocalypse, and I could actually give that a whole treatment on its own. That there are many people who believe that apocalypse is very real. It's just not religious.
Yeah.
It's just not one that is going to be shaped by God. It's going to be shaped by various forces. Some may be human caused, some by other natural disasters. You know, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. Anyway, I think our time is basically up here. Maybe do you want to do? Yeah.
Yeah, one more.
Okay.
Calvin, you cannot escape. You've done a wonderful job today of this vision of the second coming into something that is very much less clear. But our publications and books are decorated with imaginative paintings of this glorious appearing in the clouds. Are you nuancing the dramatic event of the second coming out of existence?
Well, I hope you picked up really clearly that is not at all what I was doing. As a matter of fact, I've shared, and that's probably a good note to close on, as I say, the actual hope of, you know, the sky shall unfold, preparing is coming, the sleeping shall wake, in your slumbering place. That's a song, but anyway, it's all words of Scripture. That anticipation, that longing is still part of who I am. What I'm trying to do is say, how do we live in anticipation intelligently? Without just stirring up fear, stirring up hype that doesn't last, that burns people out, that makes it hard for us to make intelligent decisions about how we live. Let's see. Okay, you want to, I was going to say, I guess you have a prayer you read.
We do,
so,
yeah. Okay, next week, Carla Gober will be speaking to us about, in the 4th chapter, the message we keep the main thing the main thing. And so we look forward to Calvin. Thank you very much for being here today. At this time, let's read our benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen. Thank you.